Senator, you criticize the Bush administration frequently, but you almost never criticize the Republican Party itself. Other Democrats...
Much to your chagrin.
Well, yeah, actually. I mean, other Democrats, you will hear them talk about the GOP as the party that's been wrong on all the big stuff, creating Social Security, civil rights, the war in Iraq. But you don't really do that. Do you think there is a stark difference between the parties?
Well, I do think there's a difference between the parties, but here's my belief, that I'm talking to voters. And I think there are a lot of Republican voters out there, self-identified, who actually think that what the Bush administration has done has been damaging to the country. And what I'm interested in is, how do we build a working majority for change? And if I start off with the premise that it's only self-identified Democrats who I'm speaking to, then I'm not going to get to where we need to go. If I can describe it as not a blanket indictment of the Republican Party, but instead describe it as the Republican Party having been kidnapped by a incompetent, highly ideological subset of the Republican Party, then that means that I can still reach out to a whole bunch of Republican moderates who I think are hungry for change as well.
Now, they do not see you the same way. When they talk, when John McCain calls you a socialist, this redistribute the wealth idea, he calls you soft on national security.
Yes.
That's not just an anti-Barack Obama script. That is, he's reading from an anti-Democrat and specifically an anti-liberal script.
Absolutely.
And so you have the opportunity to say, John McCain, George Bush, you're wrong. You also have the opportunity to say conservatism has been bad for America. But you haven't gone there either.
Yeah, I tell you what, though, Rachel, you notice I think we're winning right now. So maybe I'm doing something right. I know you've been bruising, cruising for a bruising for a while here, looking for a fight out there. But I just think people are tired of that kind of back and forth, tit for tat, ideological approach to the problems. Now, there is no doubt that there is a set of premises in the reigning Republican ideology that I just think are wrong. This whole notion, and it's been captured by this back and forth about whether I'm a redistributor, I think is a great example. The notion that the progressive income tax, which was instituted by Teddy Roosevelt, supposedly John McCain's hero, is somehow un-American, I think is an example of how people have gone way off track. The Republican Party has gone so right when it comes to how we think about our obligations to each other, how we pay for things, and as a consequence, because most people think it's pretty important to pay for roads and bridges and schools, what we've ended up doing is tax cuts, no spending cuts, huge national debt. There's a core hypocrisy to how they have governed over the last several years that I think has to be reversed. And so we're going to challenge those things. The important thing, though, is I just want to make sure that I'm leaving the door open to people who say to themselves, well, you know, I'm a member of the Republican Party, and I remember people like, Chuck Percy in Illinois, or Abraham Lincoln of Illinois, pretty good Republican, that there's some core values that historically have been important to the Republican Party, but just have not been observed over the last several years.
There may be some policy fights ahead, particularly on responding to the economic crisis, that will have both a practical and an ideological component. If we are looking at economic stimulus, is there a possibility that you could see in your first term, if you are elected, that we'd need an economic stimulus program that felt to Americans a little bit like a public works program, a little bit like an FDR-style infrastructure building program?
Well, I've actually talked about this, and I haven't been hiding the ball on this. I think we have to rebuild our infrastructure. I mean, you look at what China's doing right now. Their trains are faster than us. Their ports are better than us. They are preparing for a very competitive 21st century economy, and we're not. One of the most frustrating things over the last 8 years has been the ability of George Bush to pile up debt and huge deficits and not have anything to show for it, right? So if you're going to run deficit spending, then it better be in rebuilding our roads, our bridges, our sewer lines, our water systems, laying broadband lines. One of I think the most important infrastructure projects that we need is a whole new electricity grid. Because if we're going to be serious about renewable energy, I want to be able to get wind power from North Dakota to population centers like Chicago. And we're going to have a smart grid. If we want to use plug-in hybrids, then we want to be able to have ordinary consumers sell back the electricity that's generated from those car batteries back into the grid. That can create 5 million new jobs just in new energy. But it's huge projects that, generally speaking, you're not going to have private enterprise want to take all those risks in. We're going to have to be involved in that process.
Also an issue on something like the electrical grid, that's an issue of American resilience, even against the threat of terrorism. A lot of times when you look at counterterrorism officials, the things that they game out are an Al-Qaeda attack on the electrical grid.
That's exactly
well,
right.
You know, at this point, a snowstorm is an attack on our electrical grid.
That's exactly right.
Are there Homeland Security vulnerabilities that you think are fixable in ways that would also be good for the economy?
Well, you mentioned one. The electricity grid, I think, is important. I think that chemical plant security is another, where the chemical industry has been resistant to mandates when it comes to hardening their sites. But you know what? If you've got a chemical plant that threatens 100,000 or 1 million people in New Jersey, we better have some say in terms of how serious they are about guarding that facility.
Why hasn't that been fixed already?
Well, I think it is a classic example of special interest lobbying. There has been resistance from the chemical industry, and it is this, again, an ideological predisposition that says regulation's always bad, so stay out of the marketplace. Well, look, I am a strong believer in the free market. I am a strong believer in capitalism, but I'm also a strong believer that there are certain common goods, our air, our water, making sure that people are safe, that require us to have some regulation. Now, it has to be well designed, but the financial system is a classic example of a deregulation philosophy run amok. And now you see the consequences, and ironically, had we had some sensible regulation, we would not have now actually a much closer approximation to socialism when it comes to the banking system than anything that any Democrats have been proposing over the last several years. When you don't guard against excess, then a lot of times government ends up having to step in anyway in a much more burdensome way.
Still ahead, part 2 of my interview with Barack Obama.